From outside the increasingly affluent alliance, the holdout nations looked on with growing disdain, jealousy, and greed. Resisting this growing power became more and more difficult. For some countries, like Russia and China, staying out of the Earth Alliance was a matter of national pride. For others, such as North Korea and France, it was their strong independent nature. Still other nations, including India, Pakistan, and the Middle East, felt the organization was too firmly rooted in Christianity to join. Most of these countries continued to remain apart from the alliance through much of the 2090s, although Egypt and Libya entered the fold in 2093, and an increasingly isolated France finally gave in on January 1, 2096. Each of these countries was welcomed with open arms, and although the first couple of years were difficult while integration proceeded, they soon began to enjoy the same prosperity as the rest of the Earth Alliance. Seeing this, a number of smaller holdouts joined as the century came to a close, with only China, Russia, India, Pakistan, the nations of the Middle East remaining outside the envelope. In an attempt to resist what they saw as an increasing threat of annexation, Saudi Arabia attempted to organize its Muslim neighbors into the League of Palestinian Nations, but could not convince the others to accept any form of unified government that would result in the slightest reduction in sovereignty. A similar attempt by Russia to produce an alliance with the Asian holdouts failed utterly due to long-standing antipathies between all four nations. In response to these unification attempts, the alliance began to put pressure on the remaining countries to get their heads out of the sand and finally become part of the world community. Many within the alliance saw these holdouts as a significant threat to world peace. A rearmed India and Pakistan were beginning to hiss at each other again, while Russia and China had turned their own border into 1,000 miles of razor wire, mines, and gun emplacements waiting to fire at the slightest provocation. Worse still, the Middle East was fully involved in a terror campaign designed to undermine the alliance and break up its members, particularly their ancient foe Israel. Unlike the United Nations, however, the Earth Alliance had the power to enforce its will and the willingness to use that power. At first it began to influence the holdout countries by the skillful use of propaganda. Russia was seen by alliance leaders as the key to all the others, so a campaign began to sway the Russian government and people to join the EA of their own accord. The benefits of membership were extolled in public displays and on-air broadcast advertising, focusing primarily on the economic advantages of unlimited trade with Europe and America. Even more important, though, was the promise of defiance against the Chinese threat. No longer would Russia be required to hold the border on their own. Should China invade, the entire Earth Alliance would come to their aid. In the end, Russia swallowed its pride and agreed to join the Earth Alliance at the start of 2101. As soon as that announcement was made, China, convinced that Russia would rearm with Earth Alliance technology and then crush their longtime rivals once and for all, chose to jump the gun and launched an immediate invasion. The alliance responded by declaring Russia a protected state and opened fire with advanced satellite weaponry, long-range aircraft, and other assets of a technological level well beyond anything the Chinese could deploy. The war lasted only 5 days before the devastated Chinese armies retreated. However, when Russia pressed to counterattack, the alliance ordered them to stand down their forces, which they did immediately. Shortly after the 5-day war, China's government underwent a dramatic change. Virtually overnight, they began to put out feelers to the alliance. The sting of their defeat was replaced with a burning desire not to let their Russian enemies enter into any arrangement that left the proud Chinese on the outside looking in. Ultimately, both Russia and China officially joined the alliance simultaneously on the 1st of January 2101, although they continued to guard their mutual border for years afterward, and neither truly trusted each other for decades. Pakistan and India also took the hint and joined simultaneously, surprisingly without conflict, in 2102. The Middle East proved a more difficult nut to crack. Each country there had become a sort of island unto itself, and each operated terrorists against nearly every country in the alliance. The problem finally came to a head when a small nuclear weapon was employed against Israel in 2105. The explosion was traced to a terrorist organization operating out of Iran. The Earth Alliance was outraged. Something had to be done, but the outright use of military force was deemed unacceptable. The Alliance did not feel that using force against Iran would solve the problem, only exacerbate it, as occurred during the War on Terrorism a century earlier. Instead, they responded by sealing off the entire Middle East from the rest of the world, isolating them as no other nations had ever been isolated before. All land routes were closed, and all sea lanes were patrolled by a military blockade. Ships leaving the harbors were captured and interned with minimal use of force, while any citizens caught were simply returned to their home countries. Initially, terrorism continued unabated, but over time the Alliance finally managed to put an end to the threat. The trapped countries responded as if they were under siege, occasionally running suicide bombers out to attack guards, or firing missiles and artillery at their neighbors. The Alliance responded by gradually destroying anything that could be used as a weapon. Even this would not be enough to convince the besieged nations, so with no other options available, the Alliance decided to invade each country in turn. As Earth Alliance forces crossed the border, the greater portion of the people flocked to them as liberators, happy to be rid of their oppressive leaders. The era of independent nations had finally come to an end, and while it didn't happen the way the Alliance founders hoped it would, Earth was at last unified under a single government. Although all seemed to be going well for Earth, this was not entirely the case. Not every nation appreciated the way the Alliance conducted its affairs. The old nationalities were difficult to forget, after all. For every decision made that benefited one area or region, someone else felt slighted, or grew jealous of someone else's perceived prosperity. Nowhere was this more apparent than in the Alliance's early forays into space. The United States and European Union had pursued space programs long before the formation of the Earth Alliance, and thus were naturally far ahead of all other countries. The Russian and Chinese programs were woefully behind following World War III, while no one else had the technology base to put anything significant into orbit. Worse still, the Alliance made a far-sighted error in continuing to operate their space exploration efforts from within America and Europe instead of expanding into other nation-states. As a result, the work performed in colonizing the Moon and Mars became seen as a matter of American and European pride instead of something the entire Earth Alliance could share. As the Alliance moved gradually into space, civilian investments naturally followed. Eventually, companies and wealthy individuals began to expand to the asteroids and outer planets, looking for mining opportunities. The solar system proved to be a vast storehouse of wealth just waiting to be tapped, but only those with the proper technological backing could get to them. Eventually, some of the less scrupulous nations, as well as certain organizations just beginning to grow in power, discovered it was cheaper and easier to seize the profits of others instead of earning them honestly. This was the origin of the very first raiders, who began by lurking near established shipping lanes, but eventually moved on to scouring the asteroids and terrorizing any honest miner they encountered. In response to this, the ever-growing population of corporate miners demanded action. While some of these raiders were independent, the vast majority were funded and backed by greedy nations or those who felt slighted by the greater influence of America and Europe. Unwilling to risk enraging those states by direct action, and lacking any sort of non-orbital space-based military funding, the Earth Alliance sat idly by and did nothing while the raiders grew in power. Frustrated, the miners, now referring to themselves as Belters despite the fact that not all of them operated in the traditional Martian-Jovian asteroid belt, began arming their ships and fighting back. This resulted in an arms race and the development of the first organized raider band. To counter this, the miners created the Belt Alliance, a group of like-minded Belters dedicated to defending its members against piracy in all forms. By the mid-2120s, This new organization became quite formal, requiring membership by all Belters and operating under a code of honor that required all miners to answer distress calls from fellow prospectors. The old tradition of staking a claim and then earning all the wealth that Strike offered was discarded in favor of a group-sharing program with bonuses for those who worked harder and found new opportunities. In many ways, the Belt Alliance became a union that shared its profits and provided for its own defense. It was on its way to becoming the first privately owned military force in space, even going so far as to construct its own fighters. These simple, one-man craft, the precursor to what would one day become the hardy and inexpensive Delta V, were attached externally to Belter ships where they could quickly be deployed against any raider vessel that threatened them. In response, of course, the raiders quickly developed or bought fighters of their own, and soon both sides escalated to attack vessels and warship. The Belt Alliance, often referred to as the BA, is a product of the same stresses that created Earthforce. The two organizations are often thought of as half-brothers, although in fact, one has a strictly military purpose while the other does not. Where Earthforce is concerned with defending the Earth Alliance and all its interests, the Belt Alliance exists solely as a means to support civilian and corporate shipping. Indeed, the Belt Alliance had its very origins in the corporate sphere. Once the asteroid belt was opened up to civilian prospectors in the early 2100s, various rival corporations sent teams out to secure the largest and most valuable asteroids, Ceres, Vesta, Pallas, Juno, and many others discovered centuries before by telescope. Some of these huge rocks were as much a kilometer across, though most were far smaller. Once a suitable target was claimed, the corporation set up a mining outpost, using Martian industrial colonies as a base of operations and as clients. While most of the larger asteroids were quickly taken by corporations, thousands of smaller ones remained, and not just in the belt between Mars and Jupiter. The solar system literally swarms with chunks of debris and cometary material left over from countless millennia ago, and it was this that independent Belters sought out with abandon. Many of these early prospectors became quite wealthy, and in much the same way as the gold rush of the 1840s drew hordes of miners to California, the outer solar system was soon inundated by would-be Belters. Sadly, as the number of viable asteroids rapidly declined and the possibility of instant wealth dwindled to a memory, many of these poverty-stricken prospectors turned to piracy. The Belt Alliance originated as a consortium of private companies who agreed to share resources and arm their ships against the growing organization of raiders in the outer system. As raiders became more and more sophisticated and the size of their cartels grew, the Belt Alliance stepped up its own development, eventually expanding to the point where it achieved independence from any one group of corporations. By now it was more like a union, using dues and membership fees to finance the addition of weapons to otherwise unarmed freighters and mining craft. In addition, mercenary pilots rushed to join the newly created fighter corps, eager to see action and make a name for themselves. By 2126, the Belt Alliance was large and strong enough to apply for legal corporate status, which was granted. Now legalized and legitimate, they attracted tremendous business to themselves and to Mars, where factories now turned out space fighters by the dozens. Even this, though, was unable to stem the tide of raider activity, which threatened to expand out of control. What few knew was that many of the companies on Mars that produced and sold arms for Belter use were simultaneously arming raiders on the side, turning a tidy profit by acting as middlemen for both. They were, in fact, putting on their own war, all in the name of money. Sadly, this fact did not come to light for many years. In the meantime, incidents began to mount, and raiders became bolder. In 2129, they attacked and seriously damaged a large mining station on Ceres, killing half the workers there and making off with almost 6 months' worth of processed ore. Early in 2130, a veritable horde of raiders descended upon a well-defended corporate outpost near Saturn's moon Triton, resulting in the first serious space battle in the history of the solar system. Although the raiders were defeated, the loss of life was tremendous. Other incidents occurred, and while few were nearly as spectacular, the media on Earth and Mars turned them into spectacles. Vids of floating debris following raider attacks, especially those with flash-frozen corpses among the wreckage, were particularly enticing. A groundswell of public opinion encouraged the Earth Alliance to create Earth Force to help police the system and drive out the raiders. Initial encounters between Earth and Belter forces were less than auspicious, but soon the Belt Alliance learned to just keep out of Earth Force's way. The power of the pirates was soon broken, and once the major cartels were defeated, Earth Force began to root out their suppliers. The trail led back to Mars, but of course by then most of the profiteers had departed with their ill-gotten gains. Soon other races learned of the Belt Alliance and began to hire them for escort work into or near Earth space. The Belt Alliance accepted these jobs so long as they did not come into conflict with Earth Force. Clearly, it would not do to ship into enemy space during wartime, for example. Again, the leadership of the Belt Alliance went out of their way to ensure they operated wholly within the domain of their own charter, thereby ensuring good relations with Earth and the highest possible profit margin at all times. In addition to working with alien races, the Belt Alliance soon began to hire alien citizens as well. Soon, Drazi, Berkiri, Narns, Centauri, Pakmare, and others could be found within the ranks of the Belt Alliance, usually operating on cargo runs or escort duty within their own territory. This, as much as diplomatic efforts, went a long way towards establishing humanity as one of the newer and friendlier powers within the galaxy. The Belt Alliance attempted to stay out of the combat zones during the Dilger War, although some ships were lost in territory the Dilger invaded without warning. After those initial attacks, the Belt Alliance ceased shipping anything remotely resembling weapons, but when the Dilger didn't stop ambushing their freighters and slaughtering their escorts, the Alliance pulled back all its forces from the affected areas. The logistics of the war itself were for the most part handled by Earth Force military transports, although some Belt Alliance units took part late in the war and in the months that followed. In the years after the invasion, Belt Alliance vessels were highly active in rebuilding the logistics network linking the League together. While this effort was greatly appreciated by most of the affected worlds, some Vree guilds felt the Belt Alliance was hurting their profits and took action. Fighting was common for several years, but ceased once the Belters convinced Earthdome to file a formal protest with the Vree government. After that, battles dropped off and were eventually dismissed as the actions of a few rogue mercenaries who happened to be flying Vree ship. Nonetheless, the Belt Alliance remains distrustful of the Vree even today. The Earth/Minbari War was where the Belt Alliance truly proved its worth. Although the Belters did not fight directly, except at the Battle of the Line, they were instrumental in rescuing thousands of refugees from doomed outposts and colonies. In addition, decades of experience with hyperspace travel in the region permitted the Belt Alliance to lead civilian transport ships away from pursuit down hyperspace paths the Minbari had yet to discover. In addition to these invaluable missions, armed Belt Alliance craft put themselves in harm's way on numerous occasions to ensure the survival of countless others, sacrificing their own crews in some of the most heroic acts to ever grace the spaceways. Even at the end, when Earth appeared doomed, the Belters did not scatter to the stars, but stood firm with Earth Force and died by the thousands. Despite these acts of selfless heroism, few Belters were given the credit they deserved after the war. In public announcements explaining the surrender, Earth Force frequently remarked on the desperate heroism shown by its own members, but almost never mentioned the Belt Alliance. This left a bitter aftertaste in the mouths of the Belter leadership, who responded by relocating their home base to the Proxima system following the war. Many Belters believe that Earth's growing tendency towards terra-centrism and the constant treatment of colonists as second-class citizens can only lead to trouble in the future. While all this was going on, the Earth Alliance watched with growing concern. They simply could not sit idly by while open war progressed outside the atmospheres of Earth and Mars. The time had come to project their influence beyond the planets they protected. Even those nations who originally supported the raiders agreed to cooperate, for the pirates they funded were growing more and more powerful with each passing day. The unified Earth force, until now concerned entirely with defense of Earth and its outposts, began to construct its first space navy. Known by the shortened name Earth Force, this unified military arm began operations in 2131 by patrolling the larger asteroids and the moons of Jupiter. Early on, some Belters, not quite trusting the new peacekeepers, or simply mistaking them for approaching raiders, opened fire on Earth Force vessels. Ultimately, after a brief period of mistrust and doubt, the Belt Alliance simply went back to business, happy to have someone else around to shoot down the pirate. Although Earth Force was eventually accepted and even welcomed amidst the outer planets, the Belt Alliance did not simply disarm. Earth Force police ships and fighters could not be everywhere, after all. However, the Earth Alliance could not simply allow another military force, even one as decentralized as the Belt Alliance, to exist. Such a force might eventually challenge their sovereignty. In the end, a treaty was signed prohibiting the Belt Alliance from operating anything other than light fighters and small escort craft, in exchange for greater numbers of police vessels and established military outposts where Belters could retreat if attacked. In the end, Earth Force rooted out and destroyed most of the pirate organizations currently in place in the solar system. Some did survive, primarily by becoming nomads and operating in concert with turncoat Belters who sold transit schedules on the side. Still, for the most part, peace was achieved, and a period of rapid expansion began. Yet, despite this seeming prosperity, the core of the Earth Alliance seethed with discord. But as things in the outer planets seemed to be coming under control, old problems back on Earth would start rearing their head once again. But on the brink of another world war, an event would take place that would change humanity's place in the universe forever.